And the ego gets a bad rap sometimes, but actually, in my opinion, it can be used to your advantage if you understand it and if you make peace with it. And many people actually talk about getting to this place beyond the ego. And this is where I believe it is absolutely imperative to go through that process, because when the ego is not understood, it allows for it to take control over your life, over your decisions, over your behavior, over your energy. And when you develop the relationship with it, that you use the power of the ego, sometimes to protect yourself, to defend yourself, unless you're living in a heaven-like existence and you don't need to do that, in which case this episode may not apply to you. But for those of us that are still in Earth School, living in a grounded reality where there are demons among us, some of which are friendly and some of which are questionable, and there are those that are of lower sentience among us, and there are even juveniles. I don't mean in terms of age, I mean in terms of sentience and consciousness. And so as a result, you pair that with emotional regulation difficulties, and we're looking at sometimes needing to defend and protect yourself. The ego is a very powerful tool doing just that, because let's say you need to stand up for your rights. You need to stand up for somebody mistreating you and setting the record straight about who you really are and who you're not. It is the power and the force of the ego that allows you to navigate those situations. If you have a mama bear in you, then that ego can propel you forward in very, very surprising ways. I remember in psychology class learning about the motherly instinct and how I couldn't believe it, although now I can, being a mother, how when this woman was in New York and she was walking on a sidewalk with like her baby or something like that. And I don't remember all the details, but apparently they were walking by some movers and they were trying to carry a piano and crossing their path, and they dropped the piano and it went to fall on the baby. And the mother went into crazy mama bear and actually lifted the piano by herself, is what I remember. And I don't know how it happened. I don't know all of the, did the guys let go? Did it fall out of the truck? Did it fall from some harness? I don't have those details, but she lifted the piano by herself. And you also hear of people, fathers lifting several tons of metal to save their children. And so the ego can propel us into these instinctual patterns, because the ego is a compilation of all of your identity constructs that you have. The person that you are today, especially if you resonate with a role like a mother or a father, then that's tied to the fabric of essence of identity that dictates how you show up in the world. And that is your ego. In fact, all of the underlying programs, all of the narratives, all of the archetypes that you were born in with, your family dynamics, your imprints, your early childhood experiences, your adolescent experiences, early adulthood, this is fundamentally who you are. This is what people are talking about when they're talking about the ego. It's the person that knows how to navigate in the world, and sometimes in healthy ways and constructive ways, transcendental ways, and sometimes not to your benefit. And when it's not to your benefit, that's when people will say things like the ego is out of control, or that you need an ego death experience. And I would happen to agree with them. But there are other beneficial aspects when you understand the relationship of the conscious being that you are inside your avatar that has a choice about how you behave. And when you're unconscious, you don't have a choice because you're just behaving. That's what being unconscious is. There's no self-reflection really. There's not a lot of insight. You just have a feeling, you have a reaction, and let the chips fall where they may. Let the environment around you figure it out. And so when people talk about this unfettered access that the ego has over you, the conscious being that is awakening or is awake, what they're talking about is not taking a backseat to those identity constructs, to the fabric of you that was written very early on in your life, perhaps even predestined depending on your belief system. And an ego death, I remember being so confused about this before I had one. An ego death is getting a glimpse beyond. It's actually pushing through whatever your name is. And just think about when people call you by your name. Think about how that loads a personality and how you start behaving. And so if somebody calls you a nickname, for example, you might have a slightly different behavior program that is loaded when you hear that name. That's also a part of your ego, part of your identity structure. Versus if your parents or somebody significant calls you by your full name, including your middle name, that's going to have a different impact on the behavioral paradigms that are loaded. And so now, if you take all of the names that you've ever gone by and you compose a composite image of them with just like a portrait, you might see that your face is different, slightly different. Maybe your posture is different. Maybe your dress style is different. Maybe you have a core identity, right? These are little fractured moments of you. But you take all of it together holistically, and that is your ego, the essence of the whole. And when you break beyond that, you will actually transcend that self-concept of you. And I remember driving when I was doing some quantum traveling and laying some ascension grid work out in the West United States. I remember getting close to the Sedona area and trying to break through and feeling significant resistance. And as I was driving, it was almost as though there was a part of my vision that kind of lifted up, where it was like the bottom part of my peripheral vision, which doesn't really work like that, but it's the best way to describe it. My view in my viewfinder of my avatar shifted upwards. So all I could see at the bottom of my visual field was kind of like just my forearms and the steering wheel. And it felt as though I was lifting above my head. And I felt this separation of identity where the me and the name construct of me was almost fuzzy and almost forgotten. And it was like I was poking through almost in a different reality, even though the visual field was mapped very similarly. I was poking through to a world where I knew that I was inserted into an avatar, and I knew that I was in a VR type of world, virtual reality type of world, but it wasn't like any VR world that I had been exposed to in the 3D world that I was coming from. It was much more sophisticated. And I felt as though that my visual field actually was almost a smooth transition, and that if I could pull away, what I mean by that is it was held constant from one avatar to the other, from one world to the other, to allow for a smooth transition and a smooth landing, is what I call it. And it felt as though that I could actually take my hands off the steering wheel, put them over my head, and pull out and be in a different body, different world. And when I was going through that process, which didn't last long, you have to train yourself for this. This is what I've realized because of this reaction right here. I got scared. And there was a part of me that didn't want to let go of Dr. C, that didn't want to let go of who I remembered that I was. And the fear of the unknown and stepping into another life form with the consciousness that is close enough to where you're coming from. My memories were starting to go. And in that process of identity shifting, it's very disconcerting. And this is why reality shifting actually is a practice and a lifestyle, because you have to train your brain to be able to handle moments like this. And even though I had had some pretty significant experiences by that point, including significant quantum leaps into other versions of my apartment, different set of keys, different mailbox, different neighbors, things of that sort, it still was challenging for me to lose the sense of I. And now most people are not going to do wild shifts like that and are not focused on doing wild shifts like that. I use it as an example to let you know that if you do, it's a little disconcerting. But in your everyday world, when you are trying to optimize just your normal reality, it's still important to go past the point of the person that you know yourself to be. And you can do this through meditation practices. You can do it through breath work. You can do it through psychedelic experiences, depending on where you're at and whether or not that's legal for you. It's not in every place. And you can also have it at near-death experiences. I don't recommend that you go out and try to have those, but you break through everything that you've ever known, and you start to get a glimpse of what is beyond. And you start to realize your consciousness, at least most people do, realize that your consciousness is actually the continuous element, the eternal element that is plugged into something bigger than just you and your life and your existence and everything that you've ever known. And when you get a glimpse of that from beyond, you start to realize that the construct of the self that is you, especially when it's gone awry and it's not working to your benefit, and it's wreaking havoc in your life in certain ways, you start to realize that actually that is completely derived from a time and space point. And maybe you had some archetypal fragments from a past life, some people theorize, downloaded into your infant form, and that formed the basis of your core personality. Maybe you had some leftovers, is what I'm saying. But for the most part, the you that is you is actually trained based on your existence and your genetic code, your early experiences. And so when you start to get a glimpse beyond space-time, you start to get a glimpse beyond the you that you've always ever known, you realize how much is actually handicapping you in very significant ways. And as a result, most people, when they have that breakthrough, come back to their everyday world and start to do the personal work, because they see how there are parts of themselves that are not aligned with love, that are more aligned with fear, that are not aligned with self-forgiveness, but are more aligned with the self-sabotage. And you start to see the impact that it has on the central parts of your life that matter to you, whatever those are. For most people, it's relationships and jobs or money or some fundamental aspect of the day-to-day life. And so as you break through the ego, you start to transcend it, but at the same time you start to upgrade it. And this is where the power of the ego comes in, because then you can actually pick and choose which traits to keep and which traits to discard or to upgrade. And this is what the self-mastery journey is about. This is what I represent in my work and my teachings, because first of all, I love it. It's a weird pleasure of mine. I don't understand why it's pleasurable, but it's just insanely pleasurable. It's like creating a masterpiece of the self. And so this self-mastery journey actually gives you the benefit and the option to let the ego work for you, to do feats of incredible strengths if you need to, like lifting pianos or cars, or being insanely courageous, using your voice and your power against a Goliath or against some wrongdoing that you happen to be a recipient of. It allows for you to shape and mold the world around you. And this is why I principally disagree with some of the teachings that have been distilled in modern day culture that talk about getting rid of the ego. Particularly because at some point on the consciousness expansion journey, I believe you have a selection of identity modules that you can load depending on your life path and your manifestation choices and where you're trying to shift into. And so to take the ego, the construct of you, and to just completely eliminate it means that you're giving up skills and abilities and strengths that you've gained along the way, and wisdom and lessons, and just saying, no more. And what you see is that people will discard themselves. They will lose their identity. They will become somebody else. But it is the merging of the softer parts of you with the harder parts. It's a merging in the integration of the shadow and the light. So you're not siphoning your power in one direction versus the other, because then you're just shifting polarities and you're still half weak. My personal opinion is that shadow protects. And when you understand how to use it and understand how to yield its force, it's a very, very powerful tool that's actually very necessary for navigating some of the trickier parts of the 3D world that is still undergoing upgrades. And in some places you need to be able to see in the dark, and you need to be like an owl to have that wisdom and that line of sight and understanding people's intent, especially when it's not lining up with their behavior. And that only comes from the shadow integration, from seeing and working with the shadow and other people's ego, and taking those lessons and clicking them into your conscious awareness to allow for it to direct your behavior appropriately as needed to make it through and out some of those more tricky places, we'll just say. Because when you are working with people that are heavy, heavy, heavy in their shadow, sometimes they'll go to no end to get their way, meaning they will just never stop, ever, ever, until there is an equal or greater force that forces them to. And who's going to do that? The love and the lighters? Or those that are integrated fully with the principles of the light and the dark, transcending duality in preparation to shift into a more expansive role in the universe. And it is through working with the ego, tinkering with it, upgrading it, that allows you to integrate that as well as integrate other identity modules. So listen, I am a reality shifting coach and also an ascension coach where I help you get to the next level in your lifelines, your destiny lines, your spirituality, and your consciousness. If you feel the call to work together, then definitely reach out to me. We can do a consult. My email is sacredjourneyproductions@gmail.com. Okay, we'll talk soon.